The first time Elias saw it, he was certain it was a trick of the light. He was holding a glass of water, and the late afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating the pale, almost translucent skin on the back of his hand. There, nestled within the blue-green tributary of a vein, was a single, impossibly small black speck. It wasn't on his skin, but clearly beneath it. A tiny fleck of night suspended in the river of his own blood. He blinked, shifted his hand, it vanished. Stress, he thought, rubbing his tired eyes. As a forensic audio engineer, his life was a study in discerning signal from noise. And he knew how easily the senses could be deceived after long hours spent listening to the whispers of the dead. He forgot about it for a week. Then, while washing his face one morning, he saw another. This one was in the delicate skin of his inner wrist, where his pulse was a frantic, fluttering bird. He leaned closer to the mirror, his breath fogging a small circle on the glass. This speck was just as small, just as starkly black, but it wasn't stationary. It jittered, a microscopic tremor that didn't quite sync with the thrumming of his artery. He pressed a finger against the vein, trying to still it. The speck zipped a short distance, a frantic water by an unseen pond, before settling again. A shiver, completely unrelated to the morning chill, traced a path down his spine. He splashed his face with cold water, hard, and when he looked again, it was gone. Or perhaps it had just moved into a deeper, unseen channel. He told himself it was a burst capillary, a minute blood clot. He googled tiny black specks under skin and was met with a mundane litany of medical possibilities, none of which felt right. They described discolorations, bruises, hemangiomastatic things. They didn't describe movement. He tried to explain it to his girlfriend, Anna, over dinner. It's like a tiny mote of dust, but it's swimming, he said, turning his hand over and over under the dim light of the restaurant. Anna speared a piece of calamari, her expression one of patient concern. Swimming, Elias, that's impossible. That's probably in my floater. You know, when you see those little squiggly things drifting in your vision? No, this isn't in my eye, it's in my vein. I saw it, it moved. Maybe you're just exhausted, that cold case you've been working on. You said the recordings were a mess. She was right, of course. He'd spent the last month trying to clean up a distorted emergency call, a cacophony of static and panicked breathing. His brain was probably just superimposing artifacts where there were none. He let it go, forcing a smile and changing the subject. But that night, as Anna slept soundly beside him, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, acutely aware of the 60,000 miles of blood vessels mapped within his own body. A vast, dark, and suddenly alien landscape. The sightings became more frequent, no longer just on his hands, but in the thin skin of his ankle, the crook of his elbow, the pale underside of his forearm. There were more of them now. Never a swarm, but a scattered population of 3 or 4 visible at any given time, each patrolling its own small section of his circulatory system. His initial unease curdled into a quiet, obsessive dread. He bought a jeweler's loupe. In the sterile white light of his bathroom, he would press the magnifier to his skin, his breath held tight in his chest. Under the powerful lens, the specks were more defined. They weren't amorphous blobs, they were sharp, geometric, almost crystalline. They darted and paused, their movements seemingly deliberate, not the passive tumble of debris in a current. They were like tiny, perfectly black grains of sand, imbued with a frantic, malevolent life. He started a log, a small black notebook filled with dates, times, locations on his body, and crude drawings of their movements. He felt like a deranged naturalist cataloging an impossible species. The psychological toll was immense. At work, the static he was paid to filter out began to sound different. It seemed to have a rhythm, a faint, high-frequency pulse buried deep within the noise. He would rip off his headphones, his heart hammering, only to be met with the placid silence of his sound-proofed studio. He started smelling things a faint, metallic scent, like ozone after a lightning strike, that would appear and disappear without cause. The world was beginning to feel unstable, its edges fraying. He tried to show Anna again, this time with the loupe. "Look," he pleaded, stretching his arm out under a bright lamp. "Right there, next to the freckle, see it?" She squinted, her brow furrowed with a mixture of love and deep worry. "Honey, I don't see anything, there's just your skin. Maybe you should make an appointment with dear Evans, just to talk." Her inability to see them was, somehow, the most terrifying part. Was this a folie à deux in reverse, a madness for one? His isolation became a physical presence, a cold weight in the room. He felt a chasm opening between himself and the rest of the world. A world that couldn't see the tiny horror swimming just beneath the surface. Desperate, he made the appointment. Deeper, Evans was a kind, older man who listened patiently. He drew blood, he ran tests. The results came back a week later. Perfect. Cholesterol, blood cell counts, liver function all normal. "Elias, dear," Evans said, peering at him over his spectacles. "Physically, you're in excellent health. But you're under a lot of stress. Your blood pressure is a bit elevated. Sometimes, the mind can create phenomena to represent anxieties we're not dealing with directly." He scribbled a name on a prescription pad. Not for medication, but a referral to a psychiatrist. Elias walked out of the clinic into the bright, indifferent afternoon. The world felt like a facade. People hurried past him, their faces oblivious. But as a woman in a bright yellow coat paused at the crosswalk, Elias saw it. On her temple, where the skin was drawn taut over bone, a vessel pulsed. And within it, a tiny black speck danced a frantic, silent jig. He stared, frozen. She turned her head, and it was gone. It wasn't just him, it wasn't a hallucination, it was real, and it was everywhere. His obsession now had a new, terrifying dimension. He became a secret observer. On the subway, he wouldn't look at faces, but at hands gripping the poles. At the exposed necks and ankles of his fellow passengers, he saw them. Not in everyone, not all the time, but often enough to confirm his sanity and destroy his peace of mind. A young man scrolling on his phone, a speck zipping along a vein on his thumb. An old woman dozing, a cluster of fleas swirling lazily in the fragile skin beneath her eye. They were a secret, shared infestation, a plague no one else could see. The sounds grew worse. The high-frequency hum was no longer confined to his headphones. He heard it now at the edge of hearing, a constant, subliminal one like a television left on in another room. He started noticing patterns in their movements. The specks in his own body had stopped their random jittering. Now, they moved in concert. He would watch, mesmerized and horrified, as the 3 or 4 on his forearm would form a perfect, rotating triangle, or trace a slow, elegant figure eight, over and over. It was a synchronized dance, a choreography of the damned. He began to feel them. It started as a subtle, internal vibration, a low-level thrumming that seemed to emanate from his very bones. At night, it was maddening. It felt like every cell in his body was fizzing. He took to sleeping on the couch, not wanting his restlessness to disturb Anna. Their relationship was fraying, stretched thin by his secrecy and her mounting concern. He could see the pity in her eyes, and it was worse than anger. One night, driven by a sleepless, buzzing torment, he decided he needed proof. A logbook and a madman's testimony weren't enough. He needed a specimen. The idea was monstrous, a violation of his own flesh. But the alternative, a slow descent into what the world would call madness, was worse. He went into his workshop, the place where he built and repaired his audio equipment. His hands, guided by a terrifyingly calm resolve, gathered the tools: a sterile scalpel from a model-making kit, a pair of ultrafine tweezers, a microscope he'd bought online in a fit of paranoid research, and a clean glass slide. He sat at his workbench, the bright task light creating a stark circle of illumination. He stretched out his left arm, the skin of his inner forearm pale and vulnerable. He found a particularly bold performer, a speck tracing lazy circles in a prominent vein. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the high, thin whine in his ears. The smell of ozone was thick in the air. He swabbed the area with alcohol, the cold sting a prelude to the greater violation. With his right hand, he held the scalpel. The polished steel gleamed. "This is insane," a small, rational part of his brain screamed. But the buzzing in his blood and the silent, mocking dance under his skin drowned it out. He made the cut. It was shallow, precise, a thin red line drawn directly over the vein. Blood welled up, shockingly red. For a moment, he felt faint. Then, he saw it, carried on the slows of blood, a single black speck. It wasn't dissolving, it wasn't a clot, it was a distinct object. With trembling fingers, he took the tweezers. He managed to isolate it, to lift it from the bead of blood. It was smaller than a grain of sand, yet it seemed to absorb the light, a pinprick of pure void. He placed it on the glass slide. As he moved to put a cover slip over it, it happened. The speck unfolded. It wasn't a crystal, it wasn't a grain. Tiny, impossibly fine legs, like those of a microscopic insect, unfurled from the central body. It took a hesitant step, then another, skittering across the glass slide. It was alive, a parasite. A wave of nausea and vindication washed over him. He wasn't crazy, he was infested. He scrambled to place the slide under the microscope, his hands slick with sweat and a little blood. He peered into the eyepiece, focusing the lens. What he saw shattered his new reality as completely as the first had been shattered. It wasn't an insect. It wasn't a parasite in any biological sense he understood. The object on the slide was a complex, shimmering structure of interlocking parts. It looked less like an organism and more like a machine. A piece of nanotechnology so advanced it bordered on magic. The legs were articulated filaments, and the central body pulsed with a soft, internal light that the naked eye couldn't perceive. His mind reeled: nanobots, a government experiment, an alien contagion. He stumbled back from the microscope, his gaze falling on the massive wires and drives on his workbench. His eyes landed on the hard drive for the cold case he'd been working on December 1st, 1988, the Denmark Island incident occurred. Marsden Island, a remote research outpost that had gone dark in the winter of '88. The official story was a carbon monoxide leak, but there were rumors. Strange transmissions, psychotic breaks among the crew. The emergency call he'd been cleaning up was the last thing ever heard from the station. The recording was mostly static, a howling, Arctic wind, and a man's ragged breathing. But underneath it all, buried deep in the noise floor, was the sound. The high-frequency hum, the one he'd been hearing for weeks. In a feverish burst of activity, he had isolated that hum. He thought it was an equipment malfunction at the research station. He looped a 10-second sample of it, amplified it, and played it over and over for days, trying to filter it out of the man's voice. He had listened to it for hours on end through the high-fidelity headphones. A new, more profound horror began to dawn. A dread so vast it felt like the universe was collapsing into a single point inside his chest. He pulled out the project files, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He found the looped audio file of the hum. He ran it through a spectral analyzer, a program that visualized sound frequencies. The screen filled with data, but one frequency stood out. A sharp, unnaturally consistent spike at an extremely high range, almost outside the capacity of his equipment to even register. Then, his eyes fell on a folder he'd created weeks ago, a repository of research related to the case. In it was a scanned PDF he'd downloaded from an obscure academic server. It was a discredited paper from the 1970s by a biologist named Dr. Elias, titled The Silent Chorus, Symbiotic Micromachinery and the Seed of Consciousness. He opened it, his blood turning to ice water. Thorne's theory was that humanity, and perhaps all complex life, was not purely biological. He proposed that every living being coexisted with a network of dormant, biomechanical entities he called choreocytes, from the Greek for dance and cell. He theorized these microscopic symbionts were responsible for the very spark of consciousness, the storage of memory, the complex electrical ballet of thought. They were the conductors of the orchestra, dormant and perfectly integrated. The paper was dismissed as fantasy, scientific heresy. But there was a final, chilling addendum, a section that had led to Thorne's complete ostracization from the scientific community. It was a warning. Thorne believed that the choreocytes, while symbiotic, were not slaves. They existed in a state of stasis, a delicate truce. He hypothesized that they could be awakened by an external stimulus, a specific resonant frequency, an activation signal. If awakened, he wrote, their function would change. They would cease to be passive conductors of a single being's consciousness. They would begin to network, to communicate, to synchronize. They would revert to their primary function, not symbionts, but custodians. Elias stared at the spectral analysis of the sound from Marsden Island. He stared at the description of a theoretical activation frequency in Thorne's paper. They were a perfect match. The scientists on Marsden Island hadn't suffered from a gas leak. They had found the signal. Or, more likely, they had created it. And it had woken them up. The puzzle pieces slammed together in his mind, forming a picture of such monstrous, cosmic horror that he wanted to scream. But no sound would come out. The specks weren't an infection he had caught. They weren't invaders. They had always been there. Inside him, inside Anna, inside Dr. Evans, inside the woman in the yellow coat, inside everyone. Dormant, Elias, hadn't been the first to be infected. He had been the first to be awakened. No, not even that. He had been the one to ring the bell. By isolating, amplifying, and listening to that sound for hours, he had saturated his body with the activation frequency. He had woken up his own curious sides. The paranoia, the sounds, the vibrations, it was the process of their awakening. Their shift from passive servants to active participants. And it wasn't just him anymore. The sound hadn't stayed in his headphones. High-frequency waves travel through walls, through bodies. He worked from a home studio. Anna had been living in a low-level bath of the frequency for weeks. The people in his apartment building. The man on the subway, the woman at the crosswalk. It wasn't a plague spreading from person to person. It was a signal, propagating silently through the city. And in its wake, the silent chorus was beginning to stir. He looked at his arm. The tiny cut was still weeping blood. In the vein next to it, a dozen black specks now swirled in a complex, hypnotic vortex. A miniature galaxy of terrifying purpose. They weren't just dancing for him anymore. They were practicing, rehearsing. The plot twist wasn't that he was infested. The plot twist was that he was the conductor of a plague of consciousness. He was the one who had started the music. He stumbled out of his workshop and into the living room. The window looked out over the city, a sprawling grid of lights and lives. It was no longer a collection of individuals, it was a network. A dormant superorganism waiting for the signal to begin its dance. He could almost feel the vibration of it on a grand scale. The entire city thrumming with the same energy that was buzzing in his bones. Anna came out of the bedroom, her face edged with sleep and concern. Elias, what's wrong? I heard a crash. He looked at her, truly looked at her. And for the first time, he saw not the woman he loved, but the vessel she inhabited. He saw the faint, almost imperceptible pulse in her neck, and he knew what was swimming there. And in that moment, her eye twitched, a tiny, fleeting spasm. It wasn't a random tick, it was rhythmic, once, twice, 3 times, a beat. He thought of the subtle ticks he'd dismissed in others. The rhythmic tapping of a pen in the doctor's office. The strange, eternal tune the delivery guy was humming. The way a flock of pigeons had suddenly wheeled in the sky in a perfect, spiraling formation that mimicked the patterns in his own veins. They weren't random acts, they were notes. The first scattered notes of a symphony before the conductor raises his baton. The horror wasn't that tiny black objects could be seen swimming in the blood vessels under the skin. The horror was that they were starting to swim in unison. He didn't answer Anna, he just walked to the window. The high, thin whine in his ears resolving. For the first time, into something that sounded almost like music. A complex, alien, and terrifyingly beautiful harmony. The city lights below seemed to pulse in time with it. Humanity had been a solo instrument for millennia, each person playing their own discordant tune. But now, the chorus was waking up, the dance was about to begin. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, he didn't fight it. He simply listened to the music of the dance.